Everybody, earlier this week on Monday, there was an interesting piece in the New York Times, an op-ed by Tressie McMillan Cottom on how to fight back against big tech. She says start here with her piece. It includes a reading list of many books warning about big tech, including some that have been on the show by authors like Karen Howe, Yanis Varoufakis, Astra Taylor. And there's another book out today by my guest, Claire Stapleton, that might appear. The book is out this week, so maybe it's a bit late for Macmillan's list, but it's a book out about Google. Don't Be Evil, Bad Bosses, Fake Promises, and My Escape from Big Tech. Claire Stapleton worked for many years at Google, so it's in part an autobiography, in part a memoir, confession, and I guess, would it be fair to say, Claire, a warning about big tech?
Yeah, a bit of a cautionary tale for the young person who wanders into one of the biggest employment sources available to people today.
So tell us your story. When did you start at Google?
I started in 2007. I came straight out of college. It was a very rare window for a huge amount of college recruiting that a couple of tech companies did, but Google was really the new hot corporation at that time. This is so 1 year before Obama was elected, 1 year before the financial crisis. Sort of Google was this sort of big source of hope and optimism. Technology was going to be the big driver of societal progress, and not too many people questioning that at the time. Surely not me, as someone who was an English major.
I have to say, I mean, I don't always toot my own horn. I probably do often, but I was one of the early people to actually warn. I wrote a book in 2007 called Cult of the Amateur, which warned about the utopianism of Google. But go on. But then I have my own skeletons in the closet on the Google front as well, given that my current wife is the head of litigation. So I have it both ways. But sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I was a humanities major, English major, I think looking for a real job, sort of casting around for, a real career. And I saw a posting for corporate communications, and it was very vague. It was sort of like, come tell the story. And I knew a little bit about the story because Google was, as much as it was sort of exporting its technology and innovation at that time, sort of, they'd acquired YouTube, Gmail, and Maps, and, some of the other in search were sort of transforming how we navigate the world, certainly. But I knew a little bit about the story, but as much as they were exporting technology, they were exporting workplace philosophy. It was a huge part of what Google was communicating at that time. So I got drawn into the whirlpool, and that my job was a function that I never knew existed. And it was highly corporate, though not portrayed that way, which was internal communications. So instead of telling Google's story to the outside world, we were sort of supposed to pump up the story, the mission, the values internally. And so I started giving campus tours. I worked on Larry and Sergey's, the founders of the company. They had a weekly meeting that was sort of a hallmark of the Google culture, very informal. Come and ask anything, have a beer from the keg. It was, even as Google was, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people in that period of time and hiring like crazy. They kept this sort of folksy company feel through these sorts of internal communications. And so, alongside talking about the culture and the transparency and the kind of special sauce of the creativity and the collaboration and all the office design, we were also talking about Google's mission to change the world. And the philosophy was basically capture all this talent, get them so engaged and so fired up on what we're going to do to change the world together. And here I was, a sort of kind of handmaiden or an emissary of that mission to get everybody high on the mission.
Were you at all skeptical? Wasn't it a bit too good to believe? I mean, we'll talk about Don't Be Evil in a minute and that corporate phrase that you were involved in that Google adopted, at least for a while, as their brand. Did you ever question this? I mean, it seemed, as I said, there were some of us who were always skeptical, or maybe we're just naturally skeptical, but didn't it seem, Claire, too good to be true, especially given that, you mentioned Larry and Sergey. People were becoming incredibly rich. I mean, you joined after the IPO. I presume you made a little bit of money yourself.
Nothing compared to what the
Well, but
engineers are
nobody
making.
can. I mean, I assume you made enough that you haven't had to work too much for the last few years.
Yeah, definitely. So I started giving campus tours in the summer of 2007 as a kind of low-level communication staffer, and a lot of the people coming through at that point, because there was still novelty to the campus, but we had a lot of European journalists who came through then, and I was to take them around, show them the laundry room, and which I'd heard a HR person describe as letting Google be your housewife. You can send off your dry cleaning, there's haircuts, you can go to the dentist. This is all on the Mountain View campus.
And there was the masseurs. The masseurs were always a source of great intrigue and envy.
Yes, I mean, really creepy because they're right in the workspace. So there you are kind of going in and, getting nude in the workspace. But anyway, the foreign journalists who I think, it seems like there's a longer tradition of sort of like labor protections, right, in Europe. And sort of like there was a natural skepticism to it. So I was learning how to deflect those questions because they would say, like, isn't this all kind of a big plot to keep everybody here all the time or kind of extract the most? It's sort of slightly exploitative and creepy. And it's, it's all these things, Big Brother. So I certainly heard the criticism and I certainly was able to kind of say, yeah, I mean, it is a little bit about that, though. Of course, when you're 22 years old and you're thinking this is amazing that you can get a massage and there's all these, I could understand the sort of like, rational thinking behind, if you can take care of all these annoying tasks during the day while you're working, then you don't have to think about them at home. So I heard the talking points version. I heard the skeptical version. I think that I went through a very interesting training my first year. And I think it also raised a lot of questions for me, which is that they had a guy, his name was Fred Kaufman. He was Sheryl Sandberg's sort of personal coach. He was a kind of Valley guru type. And they put all the new hires, at least in the kind of communications and marketing group, through this. And the central idea of this training, a 2-day training, was radical accountability. So ostensibly, this was kind of about living your values in a complicated, crazy world. But actually what they said was, in life, you need to be a player, not a victim. You can't blame your circumstances. If you're late because of traffic, don't blame the traffic. You should have left earlier. It was a very kind of particular sort of brainwashing. And I found a G chat that I'd sent to my brother saying, today I learned that if my team is dysfunctional, it's my fault. Like, it was a sort of idea that it's now you sort of see the strain of this in the Valley of sort of high agency. It's like you have to sort of take life by the horns. But the way that this kind of, I think, comes down to a sort of junior staffer is that really you're not supposed to question. It really reinforces, let's not question the system in any sort of way. Let's not challenge authority because everything is on you. And if you're going to climb the ladder, you better be a player, not a victim. It was a very kind of particular sort of training. And I definitely had my doubts. I think that there were certain things about, particularly as Larry Page took back the reins of the company in those first few years and became the CEO again, it was very hokey and also kind of grandiose. So, I maintained something of my own mind, but I think that, for the most part, not you, but for the most part, the world was validating Google's optimism that with all the resources Google seemed to be harnessing, and Google was just making so much money, and then kind of pairing it with this moral branding about like how Google was going to shepherd in like all these, changes to society. I think also looking back, I was surprised at how much of the rhetoric was actually about saving humanity. And you see a little bit of that to this day with, or really hardcore with AI, but Google kind of relaxed some of that.
Yeah, Dario and Sam have appropriated that language almost literally, I think, from Larry and Sergey. So, quick question, Claire. You've mentioned a couple of times that you were very junior. You're obviously quite junior when you joined. But this book, Don't Be Evil, Bad Bosses, Fake Promises, and My Escape from Big Tech, it's also about a woman who became less junior, acquired some responsibility, and eventually, I think in 2018, became involved in quite a high-profile conflict within the company. When were you no longer junior within the company? Was your rise meteoric? I mean, you lasted there, what, 11 years?
12 years, yeah. the first 5 years, I was actually quite a paragon of the ability of young people to come in there and gain a lot of responsibility quickly, because I worked on TGIF and I kind of did a lot of different corporate communications. When there was a new PR boss, her name is Rachel Whetstone. She came from London. She was keenly interested in
And the
Larry
wife, of
Page's.
course, of the current Republican.
Yes, the potential first lady of she's a fascinating figure, comes from a long kind of libertarian tradition in the UK. She's very politically minded. She was close with Eric Schmidt, and so when Eric Schmidt handed the reins back to Larry Page, she very shrewdly, I think, really focused on Larry's communications. And so I got kind of drafted in to help work on some of Larry's communications at that time, and I kept a kind of close log of all this stuff. So I was sort of an archivist of all of his rhetoric and his vision. And he, really only spoke for a very short amount of time, and then he like lost his voice. I mean, it's sort of like shocking. Can't believe it's real twist. But so I, was able to work on all these sort of like high level communications at that time. Well, I got promoted a couple times, but it was still like sort of like a mid-level manager. And then I got kind of vaulted over to the New York team, the creative agency called Creative Lab, which is this sort of like alchemist lab of basically Google's branding. But it was, again, kind of wrapped in all this sort of grandiose language about we're just here to change the world. And it sort of was like a bunch of kind of corporate gobbledygook all in one. And so there I continued to just sort of rise the ranks a little bit, and then landed at YouTube, where I was, never some senior executive by any means. I was always a kind of like rank and file small team manager, but I was always working on things that were oddly zeitgeist of the company. So the Google kind of comms back in the day, and then as Google was shifting into branding and was getting into Super Bowl ads and all these other things, and then when I was at YouTube in marketing, again, a sort of just randomly consequential area and time, as YouTube and tech in general was dealing with more headwinds in terms of how its public image and scrutiny of its monopoly power, scrutiny of bad things going on the platforms. And my remit within YouTube was to try to buoy the image, to demonstrate that YouTube's net positive to society. So I think it's less that I was, some, big executive there, and more just always had kind of a catbird seat to these sort of different eras of the company as it grew more bloated, more complicated, more executive-y. And yeah, that proved to be kind of a good story to tell throughout the book.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is some people might be watching this and thinking, oh my God, another tell-all book from another pissed off former tech worker. Of course, right. The best one, or the best known one, which has been enormously successful and controversial, is Sarah Wynne Williams' Careless People, a tell-all about Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, which has gone into court. What are you saying then? Claire, in this book, Don't Be Evil, that hasn't been said many, many times before by everyone from fiction writers like Dave Eggers to Sarah Wynne Williams, and now this army of anti-tech people. What's in this book that will surprise people that's new?
Yeah, I mean, I think, public opinion has just I would have never imagined in 2007 that public opinion about tech would be where it is. I think that, my book is, it's a coming of age set in tech. I mean, it's not, whereas Careless People is really a whistleblower's memoir that, really delivers an amazingly damning portrait of Zuckerberg and Sandberg. I think that my story is one that's very familiar to people who have been kind of, for lack of another way to put it, normie. We started in a corporate job, sort of earnest, not jaded, and sort of hopeful that in general society was, all ships were going to rise with the tide. The tech was going to be the bringer of, if not complete deliverance, some abundance. And, I think that it was interesting for me to go back and trace, just bit by bit, how my own values shifted, how my eyes opened, the scales fell. So I think it's less sort of new information that would shock anyone. There's a bit of sort of anthropology of the company from the inside. I think that it's Larry Page's leadership took it to a different place. The kind of consolidation into Alphabet took it to a different place. Social media and Trump's election took the company to a lot of different places that have changed, internally and externally, how the world sort of sees, Google and these tech companies in general. But I think it's the sort of worker's eye view, and then also I think the experience of, and the kind of sad, ending of it, but the moment of the tech worker organizing, and the idea that, wow, they hired all these young people who are kind of idealistic and hopefully smart on the premise that they could help change the world. And as we started to reckon with, what does real power look like? What does real kind of corporate accountability look like? And that relationship between the workers and the management changed so quickly and so dramatically, that I think it was kind of whiplash, for everybody who was involved in that at Google. So I think that's maybe something new and different, is that we were kind of still trying to change the world from the inside, from a different direction, as we kind of like lumbered our way through labor organizing 101. The empire struck back, I guess.
The empire certainly did. We mentioned Careless People, which is, as you noted, very, very critical of Sandberg and Zuckerberg, so critical that the book is in court at the moment. It's very hard for, I think, Wynne Williams to actually speak about it. I'd love to get her on the show. The subtitle of your book is Bad Bosses, Fake Promises, and My Escape from Big Tech. Who are the bad bosses in Google? And do they compete with Sheryl and Zuckerberg? Sheryl, of course, came from Google, so whatever bad boss skills she learned, she acquired, or whatever bad boss skills she manifested at Facebook, she must have in part at least learned them at Google.
Yeah, I think, Careless People is so interesting because it really confirms all we think about the sort of elites, the tech overlords, the people on the private jet. The scale of my bad bosses is more workaday and more familiar. There's a fascinating book that the old head of HR at Google, Laszlo Bock, wrote called Work Rules.
He's been on the show many years ago as well.
How Google thought about management. Management is so important. I mean, it is a crazy, it's something that deserves a lot of consideration, operationally. It's a big part of how organizational dynamics and cultures play out. And he says in this book that Google specifically didn't want they wanted to constrain managers' power, because if managers have too much power, they become quite corrupt. They can abuse their power, because it's petty in a certain way. And, I think that the bad bosses that I'm talking about were just sort of like a level or two above me. There's a strong strain of the bullshit jobsification.
Yeah, you mentioned in your piece, and there's an excellent excerpt actually from it in a recent issue of the New Yorker, The Voice of Google. You talk about David Graeber's book about bullshit jobs, and that really resonated when you read it.
Yeah, it really blew my mind, because I had just come on to a marketing team within YouTube, which was called Curation, which I never really understood. It was called Curation Strategy. I never really understood it, even as I kind of got going in this job, because YouTube is not a curated site, really, right? There used to have some sort of editor's picks, and, it does have, if you look, there can be an official music playlist or something like that. But it was a pretty big team, and we devoted a lot of time to doing the strategy, doing the internal optics, the dog and pony show to kind of get more headcount, more budget. And kind of by way of introducing himself to me, my counterpart in London G-chatted me this essay, which preceded the Graeber book. There was an essay basically about the kind of soul injury of having a job doesn't need to be done. I mean, if we didn't do our job as curators of YouTube, literally nobody in the world would notice. And yet there was this turn within the culture, particularly in the marketing department of Google, and I'm sure this is true across big tech, where everybody's justifying their fiefdom at all times. And so you get people who are incredible salesmen internally of their work. But then as that translates down to the people actually doing the work, you're sort of managing agencies, and it's a lot of, I just found this team was incredibly demoralizing. People are just kind of disappearing to the gym for hours in the middle of the day. It was kind of like a, make work or like a jobs program. And I was just sort of like, wait, I thought we were supposed to be, doing
But is
whatever,
that,
simply.
I take your point, Claire, and we've all worked in organizations and seen that up front. But is that unique to tech? I mean, you could have been working at Unilever or a big bank or Kellogg's or some other large corporation. You would have found the same thing. It doesn't. It seems as if that's certainly not unique to tech.
Oh, absolutely not. And Graeber was talking about lawyers. There's tons of people out there in white collar jobs. I mean, of course, there's sort of McKinsey consultants and these people that are kind of just circling around these other industries, cottage industries. But I think that the only difference with Google and with the marketing department that I saw was that it was so the budget was ballooning. It was so big because Google was just making so much money. There were no constraints, almost no constraints. And so people who were sort of clever, like I've had, this manager, sort of my last few years there was the person I ended up accusing retaliation after the lockout. She was a genius at just sort of packaging up the work to get a bigger budget, to get more headcount. It never really felt like, as a person on that team, that it was really adding up to anything, because we would do these huge International Women's Day campaigns that no one ever saw, World Refugee Day. And it was like you'd have people for months, creative agencies, working on the concepts and all this. And I think if you had, like a CPG company, if you are Unilever or something, you're selling a product. My husband's an architect, and he would hear about what I was working on in these big social media campaigns, hashtag campaigns we were doing. And he would be like, how does this connect to sort of Google's bottom line or YouTube's bottom line? But our work was about increasing the brand perception, which is kind of not easy to measure, or if you can't really measure it. I mean, you could sort of measure it anyway, and you would have data analysts who would be kind of drumming up the stats to make it look like these campaigns were hitting the ground running, and it was sort of improving YouTube's view in the world. Meanwhile, then there'd be a New York Times article about how pedophiles are, breadcrumbing each other through, YouTube videos with code words and all sorts of things. It was like, well, that's definitely going to tank the International Women's Day campaign that we're running. But, it just sort of seemed like there weren't many constraints. And
right. No, I take your point, Claire, although it doesn't seem entirely coincidental that on the one hand, Google's enormous success is as an advertising company, whether it's the Google search engine, YouTube, or perhaps even Gemini AI. They're still selling ads around it. And the fact that your job was in branding Google. So I assume those two things, that the connection between its business and what you were doing within the business, it must have occurred to you that this wasn't purely coincidental.
Yeah, sure.
So what happened? So you were this junior person who became less junior, involved in sort of mid-level marketing bureaucracy. You had bad bosses, but most of us won't have heard of them. Certainly not of the brand recognition of Zuckerberg or Sandberg. Fake promises, which certainly is true of many other tech companies. How did you, quote unquote, borrowing from the subtitle of your book, escape? What was the big fight you got involved with? And was this brewing for a while, or did it suddenly just erupt?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was sort of the idea of the book was, how did I end up kind of blowing up my career? Because when I left Google, I was like, in a flume of righteous anger that, my job had been sort of made redundant after the walkout, and I'd fought back, and the fighting back made everything worse. And, anyway, so I sort of ended up, leaving just a few months after the walkout. And so, while I was, righteous about this, later over time, I realized, I blew up my career there, because raising your hand to organize a protest inherently comes with risks that involve, probably inevitably losing your job, particularly if, as I was in this kind of corporate optics management job. So it's not going to be really well aligned with my job to be, on Kara Swisher's podcast, eviscerating the management of Google and all those other things. So, where I traced that was that, I came back from maternity leave in 2018 with my first kid. It had been the summer of Me Too. There was this fascinating internal controversy at Google where a mid-level engineer had written a memo about basically how misguided all the diversity and equity programs and all the funding at Google were, kind of foreshadowing a sort of, the right-wing strain of, anti-woke, DEI stuff. basically saying because women are poorly suited to be in engineering. He was kind of cobbling together some different social science to say, women are they're not rational, they're too emotional, they're more, relationally oriented, they're not effective engineers. And so it's a huge waste of time and resources for Google to try to, create equity on these teams and hire women. So there were a couple things where there was starting to be rupture with the females of the company, because I think, this is not total bro culture startup stuff. I mean, Google had always sold itself as a very equal opportunity workplace, progressive workplace of the future. And yet it was this sort of summer of Me Too, the Damore memo, and then the kind of, match that lit the flame was this New York Times story about Andy Rubin, the founder of Android, who had been accused of sexual harassment. It was a complicated story, but Google had investigated these claims, found them credible, and they ended up saying, okay, we got to get rid of Rubin, but probably contractually, however, it was decided between, with the Android, his contribution to the company, he was paid $90 million. So it was a very salacious golden parachute package that was reported on in the Times. And then there were a couple of other stories that were told in this article about women who'd either been propositioned as they were getting hired for a job or just harassed in the workplace, or a woman had had a baby with David Drummond, who was at that time the head of the legal department, also oversaw HR, and they had a very kind of contentious custody situation, all this. Anyway, so the women of the company were starting to talk, and I had been really engaged in a listserv of moms of the company as I was sort of having, kind of a bumpy transition back after maternity leave. And the women just started telling their stories that were kind of just sad and appalling, and sort of like, I think, it was a moment where Google, it was kind of foisted by its own petard here, because it wasn't like Wall Street in the 80s where women, expected sexism. They expected more from Google because Google always put itself out there as this paragon of ethics and workplace environment and all these other things. So I think that there's just started to be this gap that felt quite familiar to me, having been so close to the messaging and the rhetoric of the company of, where all these places where Google seems to be falling short. So the women kind of brought some questions to TGIF that week, the all hands meeting with Larry and Sergey, and they read the corporate statement. I think it was this kind of a very radicalizing moment for me, knowing that I'd been the kind of person to write those talking points before, which were designed to kind of absorb dissent, project empathy, and have it move right along. And, I think it felt like such a kind of egregious moment where Google did need to take a step back and look at what had happened, that the women of the company were brewing over here. The tech guys are getting, kind of so protected that Andrew Rubin's getting paid $2 million a month for 4 years or whatever his arrangement was with them at the end. And yeah, so I saw myself as sort of a conduit, or it was an
right. Do you think that Google had a particular problem with those kind of men? You mentioned Andy Rubin that triggered this particular storm. Eric Schmidt, of course, who was the supposed grown-up who took over from Larry and Sergey, made it into a real business, is pretty controversial in terms of his relationship with different kinds of women. There's David Drummond, who got pushed out the company for certain issues associated with his own private life. Was there a bigger problem within Google when it came to men exploiting women?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was, quite naive in a way, but it was a huge story also when I was a marketing manager. A woman I knew had an affair with Sergey, which I think kind of blew up his marriage to Anne Wojcicki, but they had worked closely together on the marketing of Google Glass. So that was pretty surprising, because he was overseeing a kind of big area within Google X, the sort of innovation factory. So, I mean, yeah, I think that the power, the money, there was a lot of sly, encouragement of, shall we say, relations. When I got there, there was the sales campus, which was referred to as the honeypot. I think that because there was such a focus on this kind of collegiate environment, be there all the time. There were kind of like, I remember in internal news, we talked about couples, like people who'd gotten married and, all these sorts of things. So it was, I think that, it's not hard to see how that sort of kind of horny, nerdy college environment becomes abuses of power and some really kind of dark situations where inevitably the person with less power is forced out to kind of deal with the problem.
Right. In the book, I mean, there were senior, as you know, there were senior women at Google. There always have been. The head of Google, YouTube, up until her very sad early death, Anna Wojcicki. There's Ruth Porritt, of course, very successful long-term CFO. Now I think is CIO of the company. Were there women, in your sense, Claire, within Google, while you were there, at least in the 20-teens, who were themselves disappointed, shocked by what was happening within this company?
Sure. And I think we had a conversation with Susan after the walkout, and she was very much like, it was almost a cliche of sometimes what women from another generation will tell the younger generation, which is, you have no idea how hard it was for me, to get to where I am and to be in the position I am. And, you have to find your ways to advocate for other women without rocking the boat. I mean, there's this, I really see that to get to that point of being such a huge executive at such a consequential, huge corporation like Google, it doesn't come without trade-offs to your own voice and ethics, because essentially you fuse yourself with the corporation. So the same two things are true. I don't doubt that someone like Susan or Ruth Porritt cares about, the treatment of women and doesn't want, for all the kind of reasons why there's mess, right? They don't want that. They want women. I think Susan was a big champion of all the maternity benefits at Google, which are still, kind of industry leading. And there's other ways that I think that these women have been able to do good things. I just think there's limits to any individual person, any individual leader, and particularly a woman who, as they would probably say, has had to act like a man, or had to
right.
Work all the harder. I think Susan was a mom of 5, which is insane when you think about the sheer amount of time that she put into being the CEO of YouTube. It's a complicated set of trade-offs, I think, that come along with rising that high for man or woman.
And of course, Susan knew Larry and Sergey right at the beginning. She gave them their initial garage space, so she was certainly part of the family. And in the name of, shall we say, affirmative action, I think it would be fair to say that Sarah Wynne Williams' most controversial, one of the most controversial accusations in Careless People is about the sexual bullying of Sheryl Sandberg towards Wynne Williams herself. So this is not just men behaving badly, it's also women behaving badly.
I mean, some of the villains of my story really are women, particularly at the end there with my manager. The kind of line of hierarchy in my department of YouTube, I think, did not want to have someone who was organizing and who was sort of trying to flex a different kind of power, was very threatening. And I think there's a human impulse to preserve the system. If you are comfortable in that system, if you have incredible, kind of material investment in it. And I was representing.
And you got very rich. I mean, not you necessarily personally, although you became comfortable, but many of these very senior people became ridiculously rich. When it comes to your escape, what happened? Did you get fired? Did you fire yourself? Did you just get sick of the whole thing?
So basically, my boss kind of hollowed out my role just 2 months after the walkout, and I was so indignant. I was sort of like, how could you possibly do this? Because at that point, after we did the walkout, like the Time's Up organization reached out to us as sort of like women's, legal help was offered to us. And people were saying, be very mindful of any changes to your role. So legal, you're kind of become a sort of protected status after, you step into organizing. And, it's not like we have the best labor protections in the US, but really ultimately, you're supposed to be able to kind of try to keep your nose clean and do your job, as well as you can. And then your boss really should not be futzing with it. So I was like, this is completely ridiculous that you're demoting me. Basically, you're going to hire someone above me, take people out from, the side, make them my peer, all this sorts of things. So I just pushed back through this, through the normal channels. I went to HR, I went to my VP, and, it kind of, swung around and around. And basically I ended up becoming, I think that my boss was so furious about how I was escalating this, and it was just kind of creating a big mess. So she just ended up kind of completely ignoring me for, a period of months. And so then what happened was there were a core group of women who had organized the walkout, and sort of one by one, people were encountering very similar things. It was whether it was a transfer being blocked, and people were sort of saying weird things about, are you going to have a good attitude? Are you going to foster division on the team? There were things that were kind of retaliatory things in the air. And Meredith Whittaker sort of like now was a very kind of public face of the walkout. Her role was also dramatically changed. And she was sort of given a time limit on she could either accept a new role or, basically, accept severance or something like this. So we decided as a sort of a group who was being retaliated against that we're going to put our stories out there, which was, the nuclear option, basically, because here I was had just to sort of just settle into a steady state of being kind of just like rubber roomed on my team. And so we put we wrote our stories down about how basically like, Google is continuing to, say it supports women. It's following on the demands of the walkout, and it's where everything's hunky dory in the company. But meanwhile, the, company is, doing this very other thing with all these women in their roles after the walkout. And so, yeah, we put our stories out into the ether, and Google offered us severance to leave.
So you blew yourselves up, or you blew yourself up. You knew you were going to get fired.
Yeah.
And did you get a nice payoff, or you just walked?
I spoke to like an HR person a few years later who was suing the company for discrimination, and I was telling her about my severance package, and she said, "Wow, they sure got you out cheap." I was pregnant at that point, so I was pregnant, and so I basically just asked for what would have covered me for that basically the next year. So through that next maternity leave, and
so you got a year's wages, which is certainly better than I'm sure Amazon give to their warehouse workers. Claire, some people might be listening to this and thinking, well, this woman was a bit naive. She acknowledges even she was naive. It's the nature of corporate life. And indeed, Google has a reputation of a workforce which is remarkably entitled. People complain all the time. They get free food, free laundry, free massage. In your experience in the 11 years you worked at Google, was there a sense of entitlement, not just amongst the senior people, but amongst ordinary workers at Google, that they could be both good and, shall we say, evil, or certainly good and make a lot of money at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of look at it more from the worker perspective. But yeah, I mean, I think I was sitting at the side of the stage of TGIF for all these years. I mean, sometimes it was funny, right? That people would complain about, they were trying all these social experiments to move around the junk food in the snack kitchens, and people would kind of get up in arms about like, we can't find the M&Ms and things that like, sounded completely, ridiculous. And, what a kind of entitled or spoiled workforce. Sure. There were a category of things because Google, again, was sort of pumping the employees with it was, pumping us with a certain level of, you are the chosen people and we take care of you so well. And so it's sort of like there was a level of dialogue that could be annoying. But there were plenty of things where, the company, would exert its power and the kind of like authoritarian force that it had. I remember one of the biggest internal controversies I saw the first year was that they had a highly subsidized daycare program, and then they just like raised it to market rate, or they had reasons why they were doing it. It was expensive and blah blah blah, whatever. But it created great hardship for even if people who were kind of, I guess, decently well paid workers. It was like sort of like the company could be callous and could change things around and only see things from the perspective of, you guys are all so privileged here, and how could this possibly impact you? And this is annoying for us to be running, in the red on this program. And so there were always things in the worker management relationship that felt sort of contentious. We can give and we can take back. I think also that Google really believed at that time that, treat people. I mean, Larry Page said this all the time: treat the workers well, and they will contribute tenfold. We need people. We want the best team in the world with all these people, these minds combined. We can not only win every, technological race and technical race, But we can solve these problems together because there's no end to our ambition as a company if we have these amazing people and we treat them so well. And that's, I think, what's been so shocking is that the company has swung back this completely other direction. And this is a trend across tech and, white collar industries in general, where the bosses are sort of saying, your job could easily go to AI. So you should be really grateful.
But is that really true? I
the
mean,
relationship so extremely.
Claire, I mean, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, was famously, of course, one of the tech execs at the Trump inauguration. But isn't Google a little better, certainly, than Zuckerberg or Musk or some of the others, Dario and Sam, who are utopian and childish at the same time, or maybe all utopians are childish? Shouldn't we trust Google a little more? I mean, maybe the points you make in Don't Be Evil are correct, that Google isn't quite the company it thought it is. But when it comes to grown-ups in the room, or certainly grown-ups in Silicon Valley, I certainly would trust Google and Sundar more than Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Dario Amodei or Sam Altman.
Yeah, you don't have really the sort of noxious star. I mean, I think like Sundar is probably someone who's very good at harmonizing and balancing all these sort of different, stakeholders. He's not the kind of brash bravado of these other, or the kind of ego and the hubris, I think, of these other people. I mean, I think like what's just kind of scary and interesting about Google is it's everything. I mean, if one company sort of owns the infrastructure of the digital world, and increasingly just sort of like the world in general, because the lines blur. Google's just a tremendously consequential company. So I mean, I think that is it more evil than any other? Is it less evil? I don't know. I think it's so complicated, and there's so many different kind of balancing forces. And there's still, a lot of amazing people at a company like Google, who seek to want to do the right thing and who want to be ethical. I think it's more a question of, using their own rhetoric against them to say, what are ways that we can hold these companies accountable? Because, they amass more money and power and sort of consequence to the social fabric, with every passing year. So, yeah.
I mean, the problem, as you note, is that Google's hard to avoid. You were recently on a YouTube show talking about starting a movement with your writing. And of course, the movement you're starting is in some ways anti-Google and anti-YouTube. So it's hard to avoid these companies. So let's end where we began, Claire, with Macmillan Cotham's piece in the New York Times on fighting back against big tech. You fought back against big tech. You fought and you lost, really, in a sense. In terms of your career, you were, as you said, pushed out, forced out, discouraged from staying at the company. What can we learn about this fight against big tech, both inside and outside big tech companies like Google, from your book? What lessons are you giving young, idealistic people who still no doubt work at companies like Google? What's your message?
I think that in some ways the newer, younger workforce has the advantage of the world not being so in thrall of tech. And I heard that they show a Claude ad before the Odyssey in theaters, and people are booing. I mean, it's sort of like there's this. Even as we give more and more of our lives over to tech, there is a sort of natural mistrust that, we sort of all share. I think, my story is so much about, your identity in work and how much we sort of outsource a sense of moral identity and moral compass and values to an authority figure. I mean, it exists in so many different facets of life, but it was very true for me, coming into the environment of Google and saying, okay, the management says this, so I believe this. And, that's my kind of, journey and my growing up and my maturing. And it's the advice I would give to young people, which is having some skepticism, being able to kind of hold your own values in your own mind, letting work, be part of your life without letting it take over your life. And I think that, my story of kind of brashly sort of pushing back against the company and hoping that would kind of create some, radical linear change. Of course, that's not how it works. But I do think that people are faced with all sorts of ways to push back, to show up for each other, to kind of create more solidarity that doesn't have to be, the corporate line. And I think it's smart and it's healthy to cultivate that instead of just, letting the overlords do their overlord thing. Having a healthier relationship with our tech, with our work. That's definitely the message.
There's the message. It's out. It was out yesterday. Don't Be Evil, Bad Bosses, Fake Promises, and My Escape from Big Tech by Claire Stapleton. Used to work at Google. It's been out for 10 years of the company, Claire. You've been doing more important things, having kids, bringing them up. Congratulations on the new book, an important addition to the anti-tech